Today we're talking about nutrition and osteoporosis, and one of my favorite things about being a dietitian is the education piece. So right now, like she said, I'm not in clinical practice, but I'm writing and educating. And what I love about that is helping people kind of delve into the misinformation about nutrition and food that's out there, because there's a lot. You see headlines and social media and all the things trying to tell you this is the perfect way to eat, and this is the food you need to eat, and this is the food you should skip, and you need these supplements, and it's a lot, and it's confusing. And I'd say 75% of the time, it's not right, or it's not right for your body. It might work for your neighbor, but not you. And so today, my goal is to go through a lot of information about nutrition and bone health and kind of keep it evidence-based so you can really understand the food and how nutrients work to support your bone health now and for the rest of your life. So these are our objectives. I'm briefly gonna give some bone background just to have an understanding of foundation. Then we're gonna delve into nutrition and discuss, there's a lot of nutrients involved, so I just am highlighting some. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's the most common and some of the most important. And then how we're gonna put it all together to talk about how you can follow the right diet for you, for your bones. So here we're taking a step back from food for a second, just to make sure we understand how bones work, besides keeping us upright. So our bones are constantly changing. They're breaking down, we're building them back up. Earlier in life, we're favoring building them up, and kind of later in life, our body tends to break down a little bit more. It's a really specialized system that involves a complexity of hormones, enzymes, specialized cells. Some of these cells include osteoclasts, so these are cells whose job is to remove old or damaged bone fragments and bone cells from your body. And then osteoblasts are the ones that help build it up. So I think of blasts build, right? So those are the ones that work hard to build up bone. So what we want, like anything in the body, is kind of a balance, an equilibrium. And when the scale tips too far, so we lose too much bone without replacing it, it can become a problem. And this is when you lose bone density. And we talk a lot about bone density later in life, and that's because it's a measure of our bone strength, or how much mineral is really packed into our bone tissue. And this is measured by a DEXA scan, which hopefully most of you are familiar with, because you should have had one of those probably by now. And that you end up with a score, and this score compares your bone health to that of a healthy 20-year-old adult. And so the farther away your number is from that, the more likely you'll be diagnosed with osteoporosis. And so what's the difference between osteopenia and osteoporosis? So osteopenia, people familiar with prediabetes? Yeah, so it's kind of the same thing. You have osteopenia before osteoporosis. You have prediabetes before diabetes. It just means, osteopenia means that your bones are weak, and if it's not addressed, it can lead to osteoporosis. And osteoporosis is an actual diagnosis of that low bone density, those lower T-scores. And when you have osteoporosis, your bones are brittle, so they're more likely to break, and that's a concern because even minor trips and falls that wouldn't necessarily be a problem otherwise can lead to significant problems. There's things you can do in both of these, both with medication and lifestyle, so neither is the end of the world. Osteopenia, obviously, there's a little more wiggle room to make positive changes, but there's still plenty of things you can do with a diagnosis of osteoporosis as well. So why do we care about this so much, aside from nobody wants to break their bones? It's estimated that 10 million Americans have osteoporosis, which is a pretty staggering number, and about 44 million have low bone mineral density, so maybe haven't been diagnosed yet. Studies also estimate that about 50% of women and up to 1 in 4 men will break a bone in their lifetime due to osteoporosis. So aside from it being a problem just because you don't want to break your bones, that's uncomfortable. Financially, it costs a lot of money, but the major is the loss of quality of life. Some studies actually say that hip fractures, when someone gets a hip fracture, there is an increased risk of death in that year following. Besides that, you can also significantly lower your quality of life just because you have mobility issues. So even when you heal, I shouldn't say you, when someone heals, it becomes harder to walk across the room unassisted. And a hip fracture can even increase the risk of ending up in a care facility and just losing independence, which is the most important part aside from obviously the increased risk of death. So let's look at the risk factors. When we talk about any health condition, I like to divide it into things you can change and things you can't really change. And we talk about these as modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors. So the non-modifiable, the things you can't necessarily change, are being born a female, postmenopausal, so when estrogen is protective of our bones. So when we start to lose estrogen during menopause, it impacts our bone health. Anybody over the age of 50 is also at risk just because that balance of bone breakdown starts tipping a little bit. Being Caucasian, if you have a family history, genes, that increases your risk. Certain health conditions like diabetes can also increase the risk. And then I put medications here. This is kind of a non-modifiable, but also maybe modifiable depending on your health condition, right? If it's steroids, can increase the risk of bone loss. If you have a condition that you might be able to substitute out another medication, that could be modifiable, but some people just can't. And also, your care provider is going to look at immediate concern versus long-term concern. So if you need a medication right now to keep you healthy and expand your lifespan, the slow loss of bone is less of a concern, so they're going to prioritize that. But there's a lot of modifiable risk factors too, and these are really important to pay attention to. So we know that exercise and movement, those weight-bearing exercises are incredibly important. Being underweight and overweight are equally as important for bone health. Those are modifiable, although not always as easy. Nutrition, as we'll talk about, and then smoking and excessive alcohol intake are all linked to osteoporosis. So I am not an expert on treatments. It's out of my wheelhouse, but I'm just going to cover it briefly because I think it's important. So your doctor, your care provider works with you, and your treatment will depend on the severity of the bone loss. So if you have osteopenia versus osteoporosis, they may prescribe medications. So these medications can either slow the bone breakdown or they help build up the bones again. And sometimes with the diagnosis of osteoporosis, some of these medications can actually put you back, rebuild bones so that you move back into osteopenia. There's a lot of side effects. Sometimes you can't be on them for so long, but they do have their place when necessary. This is my wheelhouse, and so this is where I'm spending my time. And I think it's really, really important to note that it's never too late, that diet, exercise, and your lifestyle choices matter whether you have osteopenia, whether you have osteoporosis, whether you're at risk, whether you're healthy, whether you're on a medication, it still matters. And in fact, if you're on a medication, it's just as important to follow these. The medication won't work necessarily as well without some of these important factors. And I think it can be kind of empowering to think that up to 50% of your bone health actually can stem from your choices, your lifestyle choices, and your environment. So yes, you have those non-modifiable risk factors, but you also have things that you can change and that you do have a little control of when it feels sometimes health conditions can make us feel like we have a complete lack of control. All right, now we will dive into nutrition. If you think about it, diet literally provides the foundation for healthy bones because the minerals and the nutrients that you eat are used to make your bones. So they work together to help protect against osteopenia, osteoporosis, and fractures. You need a lot of different nutrients. It's not just one. So you need macronutrients, which are things that you need in big quantities. So protein, fat, and carbohydrate, those are your macronutrients. Micro, because they're smaller and you need smaller amounts of them, are your vitamins and your minerals. But these are as important, if not more, than the macronutrients, even though you only need small amounts. If you don't take anything else away, if you forget everything else I say today, I think the most important thing is that there's no single nutrient that solves the problems and that helps with bone health, that they have to work together. And so nutrition studies are complicated because we'll take one thing like calcium and we'll give it to everybody and say, okay, let's see how their bones do. And some people do well and some see no changes. And a lot of that has to do with we are all different, but also because the food that we eat is a combination of a lot of different nutrients, right? You don't just eat calcium and you don't just eat vitamin D. You eat them together and they do the same thing in your body. They work together. So you can't isolate it like you would do with a medication. Medication studies are what nutrition studies are modeled after. But they're very different, right? A medication is a specific thing that you're with a specific outcome, and nutrition is kind of this beautiful rainbow of things that work together. So you got to eat all the foods to get the bone health. Okay, so we'll talk about all of them. Not all of them, a lot of them, unless you want to be here all day. So we'll start with protein. So that's one of your macronutrients, and you need protein basically for every function in your body. So we think of protein for muscles. People think of eating protein for muscles, but you also need it to make cells. You need it for neurotransmitters, those hormones in your chemicals in your brain. You need it for blood sugar balance. You need it for DNA, and you need it for your bones. So a lot of your bone volume and bone mass is actually made of protein. So that's one reason you need it. But the other reason that you need it is because protein makes these hormones, you need enough to make the hormones that support the bone formation, that help those cells build up the bone that we talked about in the beginning. The question of how much protein you need most of these are more complicated, but we have recommendations to kind of help us get a baseline. So at minimum, you need 0.8 to 1 gram per kilogram. A kilo is 2.2 pounds, if you want to do the math there. And this amount can vary because your activity level, your health status, all different things can affect how much protein you need. So a good rule of thumb, I think, is to aim for a minimum of 20 to 25 grams at each meal. And that maybe sounds like a lot, but for example, 3 to 4 ounces of chicken, you'd meet that. So it's not too hard to meet as long as you include it in your meals. So you can get protein from animal products, so poultry, fish, eggs, dairy, but you can also get it from plant-based foods, beans, nuts, seeds, legumes. Those are all good protein sources. And soy, which is not on there. I did want to address something that comes up. It kind of seems cyclical, so it goes away and it comes back, but there's something called the acid load hypothesis that was around a lot. And this was based on some older studies that said if you ate more protein, especially from animals, it was bad for your bone health. But a lot of more recent studies have found that higher protein intake is actually beneficial for your bones, which makes sense for what I just described. And when they looked at this, there was no difference between plant or animal protein. But the caveat here is that the authors say this is within the limits of a balanced diet. So that doesn't mean eat a hamburger 3 times a day from McDonald's, right? Nothing against McDonald's. But you need other nutrients, again, because they work synergistically together. And so all the positive outcomes in these studies really depend on the intakes of these other nutrients that I'm going to go over in a second as well. So yes, protein is important, and no, it's not going to adversely impact your bones as long as your diet is balanced. Any questions so far? Good? Okay. Now we'll dive into the micronutrients. Calcium I'm going to start with because that's the one that most people are familiar with. And for good reason. Calcium is the primary mineral that makes up our bones, and it's also the most abundant mineral in our body. But most of it is stored in our bones and our teeth. But calcium does a lot of other things, including help our heart and muscle contractions, and so it's really carefully regulated by the body and the blood. So much so that if you aren't eating enough calcium or taking calcium supplements, your body will pull calcium out of your bones to make sure that level stays consistent, because your heartbeat is more important than your bone health at that point. So as a result, low calcium is a risk factor for developing osteoporosis, especially when vitamin D is low, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. But is calcium what most of you think about when you think about bone health? Yeah, primarily? Yeah. So how much do we need? Men and women until 50 need 1,000. And then once women hit 50 to 70, that bumps up to 1,200 just because of that loss of estrogen that I talked about. And then men and women across the board over the age of 70 need 1,200 milligrams a day. So dairy is the primary food source that most people get calcium from. However, a lot of people find that they don't tolerate dairy very well. So you can also get it from fish with bones like salmon and sardines, soybeans, dark leafy veggies like kale and chard. And then it's also added to different milks and plant-based milks too, or in foods. So let's talk about supplements for a second, because that is one of those, do I need a supplement questions that I get a lot. And it depends, and that's kind of the boring nutrition answer, but it does depend because everybody's so different. So the first thing you really need to look at is what your daily intake looks like. So if you are somebody who drinks a glass of milk in the morning, maybe at night, and then you eat yogurt and cheese, and you eat a lot of dairy, and maybe you have kale salads for lunch, you might be getting just enough. It's important to note that if you don't eat dairy and you rely on plant-based sources of calcium, there are things in plants that can inhibit absorption. You may have heard of them, oxalates and phytates. That doesn't mean you're not getting any calcium, but it means you might get less than what's actually present in the plant because they're basically fighting for absorption in the body. Calcium absorption can also depend on your overall diet. Alcohol intake can interfere with nutrient absorption, vitamin D, as we'll talk about in a second, and total amount at each meal. So macro giant doses of calcium, trying to eat it all at breakfast probably won't be very efficient, and you may not get enough, even if it's that 1,200, like if you had 1,200 milligrams in one meal, because your body's better able to absorb smaller amounts at once. So the takeaway of my it depends, if you look at your diet and you look back at that list of foods and you say, wow, I don't eat a lot of these things, then yeah, you may need a calcium supplement. But you also don't want to take too much calcium. So if you have any doubts, ask your care provider or a dietitian to kind of help you analyze your diet, and they can help you decide if supplements are a good idea for you. Yeah?
So what happens if you take too much calcium?
So there is some indication that too much calcium could promote calcification in other areas of the body, and this is kind of being worked on still, but calcification is related to heart issues in soft tissues. So you just want to make sure that you are not overdoing it in case of the risk of that. That's one reason. Any other questions? So I'm going to spend a lot of time on vitamin D because this is kind of the hot nutrient, if nutrients can be hot. But there is a lot of news recently about vitamin D, and it's also for good reason. Vitamin D does so much for us. It's involved in immunity, our immune system. It's involved in blood sugar. It's involved in mental health, and it is deeply involved in bone health. And we know that low vitamin D is linked to an increased risk of osteoporosis, primarily because its job is to help calcium do its job. So it's a fat-soluble vitamin, which means you hold on to it, your body can hang on to it, versus water-soluble vitamins. Anybody ever take a multivitamin and your pee is bright yellow afterwards. That's because of your water-soluble vitamins that are excreted versus fat-soluble that your body hangs on to any extra. So the vitamin D's primary jobs are to help the absorption of calcium in your gut and also limit how much your body gets rid of through the kidney. So it helps keep that balance in the blood to the right levels. So it's so important that even if you eat enough calcium throughout the day, if you don't have adequate vitamin D, you won't be getting enough calcium, even if technically you're getting enough calcium. The baseline recommendations are 600 IU up to age 70. Those are international units. That's the way we measure vitamin D. And 800 international units for anybody over 70. Unlike any of the other nutrients that we're talking about today, the best, and that should say vitamin D, not calcium. The best sources of vitamin D is the sun. So you can find very small amounts in fatty fish, egg yolks, liver, some mushrooms, of course, fortified foods where it's been added back in, but the sun is how we make vitamin D. We have receptors on our skin, so when the sun hits our skin, UV rays start this whole intense process below the skin to make vitamin D. It's pretty amazing if you think about it.
Does sunscreen or sunblock
Yep.
interfere with that?
That's exactly what we're going to talk about. Yep. So the problem is that we're all very sun conscious too. So we know that the aging effects of the sun and risks of skin cancer. And so a lot of us wear sunscreen and sun protective clothing. And so you cannot make vitamin D. You need at least like 15 to 20 minutes in direct sunlight with multiple parts of your body exposed to make enough. So if you never go out in the sun without sunblock or your sun protective clothing, that's a problem for your vitamin D levels. As we age, we might make less too. That process might not be as efficient. Darker skin can interrupt this process. And also just the time of year. So when the sun is weaker, you may make less. People who live closer to the equator have better vitamin D status than we do, the people who are farther away. So because of all this, it's estimated that about 20% of people just don't get enough, which is pretty significant considering how important vitamin D is. And some experts actually believe that we need more than those baseline amounts I mentioned because vitamin D is so important. And so I think it's important, again, to think of these recommendations as they're designed to prevent deficiency, but they're not necessarily designed for optimal amounts. So somebody might need more for immunity, if they have issues with their immune system. If someone's at risk for osteoporosis, they might need a little bit more. And of course, if you're already low vitamin D, you're gonna need more to bring it back up to that healthy level. That is, of course, something your doctor or your healthcare provider can help you with. So a lot of different things influence. Even there's certain people with genetic differences, so the way that they make and absorb vitamin D in their body can differ from somebody else. So the best thing that you can do, and I'll go over all this, is get your vitamin D levels checked. And it's an easy blood test. And then it's, a mentor of mine always said, test, don't guess. Whenever you can with supplements, test if it's an easy blood test. They're not always like that, but vitamin D is an easy one. You can see if you're low, and then you can supplement based on that. And if you're just fine, then you don't need the supplements. The research is a little mixed as to whether supplements help. So some studies say absolutely calcium and vitamin D supplements combined can increase bone mineral density, reduce fracture risk, especially at the hip. And then some other studies found no differences with vitamin D supplements. And I think that's really because of everybody's differences. So if I have a low vitamin D, supplementing is gonna help improve my chances of lower my risk of not getting osteoporosis. But if you have a different risk for osteoporosis and your vitamin D is fine, then supplementing isn't going to do anything for you. So it really depends on you as the individual. Even despite all that, because we know that it's so important, people at increased risk, and of course, people with low baseline are usually recommended to take it. Do you have a question?
I wondered, when you do the vitamin D test, is it fasting?
I don't think you need to be fasting for vitamin D. No. I will say that it's not always well covered by insurance either, so that's the other thing. But if there's a website called Direct Labs where you can buy labs, direct to consumer labs, and take it to a Quest, and you can find relatively affordable labs there if you can't get it affordable through your doctor.
With calcium and vitamin D, is there's a lot of different things, types of calcium, vitamin D, what are the recommendations?
So vitamin
Repeat
is,
the question.
she asked, there's different types of calcium and vitamin D. Typically your calcium supplements are going to be just a simple calcium, and any of the ones that are in the supplements are fine. The vitamin D, I prefer vitamin D3 unless you're vegan. Vitamin D,
What was the name of that one?
vitamin D3. So vitamin D2 and vitamin D3 are the two vitamin Ds you will see. The difference is vitamin D3 will come from an animal source and vitamin D2 will not. Vitamin D3 is the active form of vitamin D, so it's easier for your body to use. Vitamin D2, your body just has to turn it into vitamin D3, which probably won't be a problem unless there's something going on in your body with how your body uses vitamin D. But you just might need higher doses of vitamin D2, if that makes sense. Yeah.
And just to note that anybody with gut issues needs to use calcium citrate because they won't absorb.
Yeah, potentially, yeah.
Was that
Mm-hmm.
you said that?
Calcium citrate is a good option. Yeah.
I have had a vitamin D test and I have too much vitamin D and I don't supplement at all.
Is that an issue in interacting with the calcium?
That shouldn't be a problem with calcium, no. Not that I'm aware of, at least. Not that I've read. That I'm hoping that's something you've discussed with your doctor or somebody about
Yeah,
that.
but-
Yeah.
I'm asking you.
Yeah, no, yeah. In terms of bone health, I have not heard anything or read anything about about vitamin D being too high, being a problem for bone health specifically. Okay.
I was just going to comment, I've been trying to find vitamin D, calcium with vitamin D3 that isn't so big that it sticks in your throat and you can swallow it easily.
Yeah.
Do you know any?
Unfortunately, so calcium is a big mineral, and so most calcium supplements are unfortunately big. You can sometimes find the chewable ones, but when combined with, sometimes I recommend just taking like the vitamin D drops or the little soft gels separately, because you're right, calcium is unfortunately big. There are some options that you take multiple times, but it's not a one time a day. So it's a smaller pill, but then you have to remember several times a day, and that's how they break it up. So that's kind of the trade-off. You're right, though. It's a huge mineral. Magnesium similar too.
Can you chew it?
There are chewable options. You don't want to chew ones that are not meant to be chewable, but they do sell different. You could. I just don't think it would taste very good for you. But there are chewable calcium options that you can find. They used to make like chocolate flavored ones, like that were kind of too good, like a little worrisome. But yeah.
There are also gadgets where you can actually do a split of pill, right? So
Yeah.
Can you do that to a calcium?
Yeah, that shouldn't be a problem for calcium. I would just make sure to keep whatever you're not using closed up and tight, but it's not one of those ones that gets oxidized easily or something like that. Yeah. Vitamin K. This nutrient is one that you don't hear about as much, but it's equally as important. And again, primarily because it helps calcium get to where it's supposed to go. So vitamin K is actually another fat-soluble vitamin, and you can find it in food, and your gut bacteria also synthesizes it. So there's several types of vitamin K. Vitamin K1 is the one we find primarily in plant-based foods and leafy greens. If anybody's been on blood thinners before and your doctor has told you to keep your intake of green leafy vegetables stable, it's because that vitamin K is really important for blood clotting, so it can interfere with the medication. Vitamin K2 is made by your gut bacteria, but you can also find it in fermented products. And this type is thought to be the most biologically active in your body, which means it's kind of running around doing its business. That's how I picture nutrients, just running around and helping things out. So that form of it is doing its job. Like vitamin D, it helps maintain your bone mineral density by helping calcium go to where it needs to go. So when we talked about the problem of calcium potentially building up in the arteries or the soft tissues, vitamin K helps counter that by directing calcium to the bones, which I think is pretty interesting. It also acts as a coenzyme, which is a helper molecule to make something called osteocalcin, which is a protein that you need for bone strength. Vitamin K also can influence genes that are involved in your bone breakdown and bone formation. So it actually plays a lot of important roles, and it doesn't get talked about quite as much. Like the other nutrients, a low intake of vitamin K is linked to an increased risk of fractures and bone loss. So studies that examine women who ate a lot of vitamin K rich foods and who didn't found that women with the higher intakes had a much lower risk of fractures compared to those with low intakes. Low dietary vitamin K is also linked to low bone mineral density in women. But one study on healthy women, so this is people without osteoporosis, found that when they ate enough, the recommended amounts of vitamin K along with vitamin D and calcium supplements, the bone mineral density improved in the forearm. So this wasn't osteoporosis yet, but it's interesting how, and once again reflects the synergy of all these nutrients working together. Women need about 90 micrograms and men need 120 micrograms per day. Your food sources, like I said, are your leafy greens, and that's your K1. And then your K2 is found in liver, which some people love and some people don't. Fermented foods and natto. Does anyone know what natto is? So it's not very commonly eaten. It's a fermented soy product. It is very stinky and an acquired taste. But it's an amazing source of vitamin K2 if you can stomach it, or maybe you're somebody who likes it. So there's certain cultures where it's revered and people love it. So, but if you're not used to it, it can be a little different. The good news about vitamin K is most people get enough and you don't really need to supplement. However, you might see, if you ever buy a comprehensive bone health supplement, you might see it because if they're I think the manufacturers, if they're going to give you vitamin D and calcium, they also want to throw vitamin K in there because they know how important it is when they work together. So if you looked at those foods that you think, I don't eat any leafy greens ever, and I never touch fermented foods, it's worth a conversation to talk to your care provider about whether you're getting enough and if supplements could be an option. And then with the big caveat that if you take Coumadin or any kind of blood thinner, you never want to supplement with vitamin K because it interrupts that, it can interfere with that medication. I know, it's warm. It's a little warm, isn't it? All right, magnesium. So magnesium is another really important mineral. It does countless things in our bodies. It helps us relax. It helps our muscles contract. It helps with our mental health. It helps us sleep. It helps with restless leg. And it also helps with our bones. And there's a lot of magnesium found in your bones. And once again, magnesium helps with calcium. So it helps with the calcium absorption. And it also helps with vitamin D. So it helps convert vitamin D to the active form. All the enzymes that are involved in making vitamin D do its job need magnesium. So again, I'm hoping you can see how these are just so closely connected that you cannot just supplement with one and expect to see amazing results or eat just one. So like calcium, your body will pull magnesium out of your bones if you don't get enough. So it's really important to get enough. Magnesium is needed for those cells that help build bones. So if you don't get enough, it's associated with reduced bone formation. But on the flip side, eating more magnesium can help with bone mineral density, while low magnesium levels are linked to much higher rates of osteoporosis. So,
Is there too much magnesium? I mean, can you take too much?
you know, magnesium's one that I don't worry about as much. I'm going to go to the supplements in a second. Yes, you can always take too much of something. There is something called the tolerable upper limit that you can look up and make sure, not from food. So it's literally impossible to overdose on any nutrient from food. I'm trying to think that through. Yeah, I can't think of anything. But supplements, you don't want to overdo any supplement just because your body doesn't need that. There's a caveat to a type of magnesium that I'll tell you about in just a sec. Women need 320 milligrams per day, and men need 420. Magnesium is found in a lot of whole foods, whole grains, leafy greens, legumes, nuts, seeds. So if you're eating a diet with these foods, you may be getting enough. It depends on the soil too. So if there's some studies that suggest that some of these minerals are less found in our food because our soil is depleted. That said, if you're getting a good variety of these foods, you're probably okay. However, it's estimated that about 50% of Americans do not get enough. And primarily because processed and packaged foods do not contain magnesium. And that's in a lot of our diets. And so, interestingly, teens and adult men over 70 are the most likely to have low intakes of magnesium. It could be if men are living alone and they don't want to cook much and maybe they're heating food up that's already pre-made, it won't have a lot of magnesium. So there's a lot of factors there. But high intakes of magnesium from both food or supplements is linked to increased bone mineral density. So if you aren't getting enough, supplementing may be a good idea. And I use magnesium in practice all the time for all different things, for people who are having trouble sleeping, like I said, for restless leg, for blood sugar. So I think that the risk of getting too much is you might get an upset stomach, especially with magnesium citrate. So I wanted to point this out because sometimes people will go buy magnesium supplements. And have you ever seen that Natural Calm that's all over the place? It's a supplement kind of at the end of the aisles in a lot of stores. So that's magnesium citrate. And it's a great product, except magnesium citrate can give you loose stools. And so if you take a lot and you're not somebody prone to constipation, just be prepared that that could be a side effect. But there's plenty of other types of magnesium. I like magnesium glycinate as an option. If that is not something you want. Some people take magnesium specifically because they're constipated, and it can help with that. But if you don't have that problem, you may not want magnesium citrate.
What was the second one you mentioned?
Magnesium glycinate, Glycinate. And that's really good at night, very soothing and calming. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up a little bit. Again, this wasn't exhaustive of the actual specific nutrients, but I think these are some of the most important. I also wanted to mention antioxidants and phytonutrients. So these are chemical compounds that are naturally found in your food that promote, help your body deal with inflammation. So they're anti-inflammatory and protect against free radical damage. So free radical damage we have free radicals in our body all the time. And everybody thinks free radicals, they're scary. And yes, if they're out of balance, they can be a problem. But even just breathing and moving our bodies and exercise creates free radicals in the body. And the body is pretty good at balancing that with antioxidants. So antioxidants take the free radicals and get rid of them and neutralize them essentially. But what can happen is that becomes an imbalance where there's more free radicals than the body can handle. And so then that can cause oxidative damage to tissue, which is linked to lots of health problems, including bone loss. So getting more antioxidants from your food can help with that. Phytonutrients are similar. They help with inflammation, and they're protective against lots of chronic diseases. There's all kinds of studies on phytonutrients. You hear about green tea, red wine, dark chocolate, all those kind of beautiful, rich foods, those all have phytonutrients, and that's why they're good for us. a big example for that for bone health are dried plums. So they contain a bunch of different types of phytonutrients, phenolic acids, flavonoids, and others that are linked to bone health. Like studies show that eating 5 or 6 prunes a day can significantly improve bone health, which is pretty powerful. You can go look it up. And finally, potassium. So potassium is wonderful for your heart, but it also helps with bones because it helps kind of reduce how much calcium your body takes out. And potassium is found in all kinds of fresh fruits and veggies, whole grains, legumes. That looks like I'm calling legumes potatoes, but potatoes, avocado, bananas, those are all good sources of potassium. And people who eat more potassium, specifically from fruits and vegetables, tend to have a lower risk of osteoporosis. All right, switching up a little bit. Now we're going to talk about foods you want to minimize. So I always like to talk about what to add, not just to what to take out, even though everyone thinks a dietitian just wants to tell you what to do, but that's not really what I want to do. That said, there are patterns of eating linked to lower bone mineral density and an increased risk of fractures, and that's the Western diet. Our typical diet, processed food, high sugar, high salt, high fat, and I think primarily this is just because those foods take the place of all those other beautiful nutrient-dense foods that include the nutrients so that you need for bones. So it's not always that these foods have reasons why they're not great, but it's not necessarily that they're damaging your bone, although there are some interesting studies about sugar, but that they don't leave space for the food that you need. So you want to minimize refined carbohydrates, sugar, packaged foods, alcohol, and processed meats. That doesn't mean you're never going to eat those foods again. You can enjoy them, but primarily you want to be eating those other foods. Yeah.
In the sodas, is it the water, the fizzy water that's bad for the bones?
No, it's the sugar in the sodas that's bad.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, because I had always heard that.
That's kind of that same with the protein, the acid, because the acid load hypothesis, it's that same, that's when people used to also say drinking Coke would leach calcium from your bones. That used to be something I remember hearing as a kid. And there's not, an acidic environment isn't good for bones, but it's not, that bubbly water is not enough to do that.
How would you talk about processed food? What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a really good question. She asked what processed foods mean. So we talk about processed foods. When I think about processed foods, a lot of our food is processed. So bread is processed. So I'm not talking about those kind of processed foods. I'm talking about foods with ingredient lists that are, this long, in packages, with hydrogenated oils, with a ton, chemical names that you can't necessarily pronounce, that are very low in other nutrients. That's the kind of processed foods that I'm talking about. So, chips and sweets, and there are some good heat up dinners, but not all of them. So some of those kind of less good for you frozen meals, things like that. Does that answer your question?
Frozen food?
Some frozen food is fine. So I will delineate frozen vegetables, frozen fruit, absolutely fine. In fact, sometimes those are better than the stuff you find in the produce aisle because they're picked when they're exactly ripe, and so that's great. But some of the frozen meals you want to just be careful of. So you want to look at how much salt they're adding, how much fat they're adding, and look at that ingredient list to make sure that you can recognize most of the things in the ingredient list, right?
Like real food.
Real food, yeah. So there's nothing wrong with frozen food, but the frozen food that has a lot of different additives, that's more of the problem.
And what about my favorite, caffeine?
Caffeine, there's not a lot. I mean, I drink coffee, so there's actually a lot of wonderful beneficial things about coffee, and I have yet to find anything that deters me from drinking it, as long as it agrees with you in terms of bone health. So that said, overdoing anything is probably not a good idea. So if you're starting your day with a few cups of tea or coffee and a little caffeine, I haven't seen anything that makes me think it's dangerous. I better go quick. Okay. The Mediterranean diet, has anybody heard of it? Everybody's heard of it, right? Because it's like the star child of the nutrition world. And that's just because studies show it's good for heart health, cancer, dementia, blood. I mean, like, you can't find anything that it's not good for these days. But really, it's just because it emphasizes a whole lot of foods that are really good for you. So it's not necessarily the fact that it's the Mediterranean diet. It just has lots of fruits and vegetables. It minimizes how much processed meat you have. It emphasizes healthy fat like olive oil. It emphasizes anti-inflammatory foods. So we like to give things labels, but it's really about the food that's in it. There's a lot of good research, though. So the Mediterranean diet shows people who follow it are less likely to experience frailty, that adding extra olive oil can increase bone mineral density, and even showed reduced markers of bone breakdown for people in this study. It's linked to lower risk of hip fractures. And one study actually showed that following the Mediterranean diet while supplementing with vitamin D, because again, you can't really get that from your food, can slow bone loss for people who have already been diagnosed with osteoporosis. And again, I think that also has, because it's a lot of those, it helps with inflammation, it helps with free radicals because of all that really potent, good, fresh produce in it. So I don't have time to go into the ins and outs of the Mediterranean diet, but if you look, there's so many books and information about the Mediterranean diet, and Old Ways is an internet site that you can look at that really goes into it more deeply as well. But I have to say that sometimes I worry our focus on Mediterranean diet limits other cultures and other food enjoyment. So any diet has the potential to be good for your bones if you include the right foods. So for example, Asian diet patterns. Studies suggest that Asian diet patterns that include fruits, vegetables, soy are also linked to a lower risk of osteoporosis and fractures. So anything that includes, like I said, those beautiful nutrients can be important for your bones. So, in a nutshell, there's no single perfect way to eat. You can look at the foods that I recommended on those and find things that you like and just make sure that those foods are in your diet. If you don't eat those foods, then maybe consider a supplement if needed. But really, you are unique, so your needs differ from your friends. So it's really important to again, look at yourself as an individual, your risk for osteoporosis, or if you've already been diagnosed, and then also the foods that you already eat and how can you emphasize all these foods. Once again, the food that you eat literally creates the foundations of the bones in your body. So without it, you just can't make the bones. And so following a nutrient-dense diet can either support further losses, so you won't lose more bone, or help you avoid osteoporosis or osteopenia. And the good news is that all these foods also reduce the risk of basically every other chronic disease you can think of. So you're kind of covering all your bases if you eat these foods. And also, I think they taste good. So that's it. Questions? Yeah.
Could you speak to Citan?
Sorry?
Citan.
What about it?
That's a protein.
Yeah, it's a soy product, so that's fine if that's something that you like.
Is there something in particular you should look for when you're looking for that, or are they pretty much all the same?
They're pretty much all the same. Sometimes they'll have marinades of things, so you could look for the salt if there's a ton of extra salt. But in general, they're pretty similar.
What? I didn't hear.
Oh, she was asking about seitan. It's a soy product. It's also high in protein.
What is it again? I'm sorry.
Seitan, Saitan, I believe is how it's spelled. Actually, maybe not.
No.
Did I spell it right? Yeah. If you haven't, if people eat it, especially if they avoid meat for an additional protein source to mix it up from not just eating tofu. So it's another option. Yeah.
What about protein powder?
Protein powder, that's a really good question. I use protein powder. If you don't eat enough if you don't eat 3 full meals a day, sometimes, especially when we're older, our appetite goes down. So that is an option. There's a lot of good choices. Things I would just look out for is some have a lot of extras that you don't need, especially if you're already supplementing. So trying to get just a straight protein powder without the kitchen sink is probably a good idea. You want without the kitchen sink, without a bunch of extra vitamins and minerals in there. If you're already taking supplements, you just don't want to accidentally double dose everything that you're taking. Whey protein is a good option if you tolerate dairy, but then I also like pea protein, pumpkin seed protein, hemp protein. Those are all options too. And a lot of them you can get flavored with monk fruit now, which is a sweetener that's not sugar, but still tastes a lot better than even like stevia, which some people really don't like. So you just want to watch out for added sugar too. Did that answer your question?
What was it called? What did you say?
Oh, the protein powder? The sweetener, it's called monk fruit. Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think of coconut sugar? It's half the glycemic index and twice as sweet, so I've been using a lot less of it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think sugar in itself is not, if you only, of any kind, if you only use a tiny bit, I don't think it's a problem. So coconut sugar, if you're using the tiny bit every day, as long as your overall intake of sugars, including like agave and maple syrup and all the things that we tend to say are healthier but are actually sugar. If you look at your whole day and coconut sugar is primarily the only thing you use, a little bit in your coffee in the morning or something, or whatever you use it for, then it's probably not a big deal. You.
What about sugar that is in fruit?
I'm not worried about sugar that's in fruit because it's along with fiber and so many other nutrients. Only people who really would have to watch out for that would be people with diabetes. But even then, fruit's still recommended. You just have to keep track of how much you're eating. Okay, you.
Soy crunchy nut toasted snack type soybeans. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, as long as they're just soybeans and they haven't been like fried. And I think I know what you're talking about. If they're just soy nuts, right?
I don't know what they do to them, but they make them kind of like a snack.
Yeah, I would think so. A lot those could fall into, that's borderline. So it's not like a cracker, but it's also not, I wouldn't rely on that as my main protein source, but it could actually be a good snack because it has high protein if you're not eating bags and bags and bags of it. Yeah.
What do you have to say about protein from like beef versus chicken? Pork.
Yep.
Lamb.
Yep. I actually just wrote an article about protein versus ground turkey versus ground beef. So a lot of this is in my head. So if you're comparing, let's just say ground beef to poultry, weight for weight, you can buy lean beef and if you look at the nutrient breakdown of both, they're almost exactly the same, which was even hard for me to admit as a dietitian because I always, spent so much time saying, oh, you should avoid all red meat. Anything in moderate amounts, I think, is okay. So should you have steak every day? Probably not. But if you're going to have general recommendations, I should say, for big health recommendations are to limit red meat to once or twice a week at the most, and then the rest of the protein should come from leaner sources. That said, if you're seeking out very lean cuts and lean ground beef that's like 93% lean, then it's probably pretty comparable because even the saturated fat, which is what everyone's concerned about, is pretty comparable too. Yeah. I think this is the last one and then we have to finish. Yeah.
So I was donating double red blood cells one time, or most times, and I get a tingle, and they said the tingle is due to the magnesium and the calcium being leached out, and they gave me a couple Tums. It didn't sound good, so I stopped doing it, but I was just wondering if you have any input on that, or?
I have never heard that. She noticed tingling after giving blood because they said that the magnesium and the calcium was leaching out.
It's giving double reds because they put in a blood thinner.
Yeah. I don't know. Well, Tums has calcium, so that's why they were trying to give that extra calcium to you. That calcium, that's what Tums is. But I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. It was fun to talk to you.